My name is Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm the Vice President of the Princeton Adult School, and on my behalf, as well as all the members of the board of the Princeton Adult School, we really welcome you very sincerely here. We're glad to see such a great turnout, and we are encouraged to try to continue our level of courses for the future, as well as for the rest of this semester. Now, everybody is here to not hear me, but to hear our faculty member, and it's my great privilege to introduce to you Michael Reynolds. He is an assistant professor of Near Eastern Studies here at Princeton University. And I'm going to paraphrase and put into a third person something that he has written in the first person describing his background and how he got to be doing what he is doing. And this is in his bio in the Near Eastern Studies department here. I'll say he. He came to the Middle East from the north, from Russia. While studying Russian in Moscow as an undergraduate, he befriended a number of people from the Caucasus in what was then the Soviet Union. They fascinated him. When he received his bachelor's degree, he returned to Russia and worked for 2 years there in the law firm as a legal assistant. He then entered Columbia University's political science department to pursue a PhD with a thematic focus on international relations and a regional one on Eurasia and the Middle East. He came to Princeton and took up the study of Ottoman and Russian Soviet history, as well as Arabic, Ottoman, Turkish, and Islamic mysticism. He left to spend a few years in Turkish and Russian archives doing research for his dissertation. By 2005, he returned to Princeton and came back to the Princeton's Department of Near Eastern Studies, where he's currently an assistant professor. He received his BA in Governmental and Slavic Languages and Literature from Harvard University. He received his master's degree in political science from Columbia University, and right here in Princeton, he received his PhD in Near Eastern Studies. So please welcome Professor Michael Reynolds. He's talking on Turkey, the Burden of Empire.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Strap yourselves in because I'm going to try to cover a lot of history tonight in one lecture. Are we okay with that? Okay. So that I do want to warn you to strap. Okay. Oh, from that. All right. To start off with, let me first just mention, what do I mean by the burdens of empire? We commonly think of Turkey, and perhaps more importantly, Turkey thinks of itself as a nation state. That is, as a state with a more or less ethnically homogeneous population, unified by a common language, a common culture, and a common history, inhabiting a defined territory. But the fact is that the Turkish Republic is really a very recent invention. It has been in existence for not even 90 years, and it is the successor to an empire, the Ottoman Empire. And so there's three questions that I'm going to try to address tonight, and they are, why did the Turkish Republic come into existence? What are the consequences of the transformation from an empire into a nation state? And how is Turkey dealing with those consequences? Now, before I begin, there are two things that historians generally, maybe really only two things exclusively that historians do. And that is, one is to deal with change, and the other is to deal with continuity. That's essentially all that we do. Most of what I'm going to speak about tonight has to do with change, but I wanted to start out just pointing out some basic continuities. One is, when you think about today, what are the three most populous states in the Middle East? They are Egypt, which has about 85 million. Number two is Turkey, with a population of about 76 million. And then Iran with about 67 million. Now, if you were to go, that's today. If you were to go back even well before the time of Marco Polo, let's say go back to the 5th century or so, that would generally be true back then. And the reason why is simple geography. These are the three areas, basically the only three large areas in the Middle East where you'll find a decent amount of rainfall. And of course, you need, not just simply rainfall, but water. As you have the Nile River, the Anatolian Plateau, and the Iranian Plateau. And of course, you need water to support large populations. And that is one thing that has not changed in the Middle East now for millennia. But if you were to go back to, say, let's go back to the 5th century or so. Today, when we think of the Middle East, or at least in departments of Near Eastern Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, generally think of the big three. That is, what are the major language groups or peoples that live in the Middle East? And first, of course, generally people think of the Middle East today, think number one, the Arabs, and then maybe two is Persians, and third is Turks. Or you can change those numbers around, but the big three, Arabs, Persians, and Turks. If you go back, let's say again, to the 5th or 6th century, you'd see the only group that's really there that we speak of the big three today are the Persians. Back then they have what's called the Sassanid Empire. The Arabs there's some tribes running around here in Arabia, but they aren't really, this is a relatively speaking rather an uninhabited area. They aren't really too much of a factor. As for Turks, they're not in the picture at all. Now, in the 7th century, things begin to change when out of Arabia you have a new faith emerges, Islam, brought by the Prophet Muhammad, and you have one of the most remarkable events in history, the Arab or Muslim conquests, where inspired by the faith and with the goal of spreading their faith, the Arabs explode out of the Arabian Peninsula, and within the space of about 100 years or so, end up bringing all this territory that you see here under their influence. It is one of the most sort of remarkable expansions in world history, and this is how we explain today. Under their rule, both Islam spreads, and in the places today we think of the Middle East, North Africa, and these parts in here, the populations gradually adopt Islam and also adopt the Arabic language. That's how it spreads. So that's why today we think of Egypt as an Arab country, whereas, again, in the 5th century, it's part of the Byzantine Empire, and the elite there is Greek-speaking. Now, so this is a map of essentially of the Arab Caliphate, the Arab Empire has also been called. Now again, it's the time of 750. The Turks are only just beginning to emerge in world history, and they aren't anywhere near the Middle East. Where they are is in Central Asia. The earliest evidence we have of the Turks comes from what's today Mongolia. They found some Turkic ruins. So it's out of Mongolia and then moving into Central Asia that the Turks begin to come into world history. And they move from Central Asia down through Iran and then into the Middle East. Now, as they come into Iran, they begin to adapt the religion. The Persians have been converted by the Arabs to Islam, and the Turks begin to adapt both the religion of Islam from the Iranians as well as a great deal of culture from the Iranians. And so deep, in fact, is the influence of Iranian or Persian culture upon the Turks that even the basic terms of religion in Turkish are oftentimes Persian, not Arabic. For example, the word for fasting in Arabic is saum. In Persian, it's aruch. It's also in Turkish aruch. The word for ritual prayer in Arabic, salah, is namaz in Persian, and likewise in Turkish is also Persian. Just to give you an example of how the impact of Persian culture upon the Turks was enormous as they come into the Middle East. Now, in Iran, the Turks establish what's called the Seljuk Empire. Here it's called the Seljuk Sultanate. Although I'm calling it Turkish, the ruling class there is actually more of a, excuse me. Again, there's a great influence of Persian culture there. And this is basically the Turks' first great impact upon the Middle East. Now, I don't know if Stephen Cock can imagine last week, I think he did speak about the Mongols, yes? The Mongols come around and they put an end to the Seljuk Empire, as well as they put an end to a lot of other things. And that's really where the story that I'll be telling today begins. It begins with the Ottoman Empire, which emerges out of the ruins of the Seljuk Empire. Now, this map here shows the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, and I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. The first is, if you look here, this is where the very beginning of the Ottoman Empire is. It begins in the western part of Anatolia. Anatolia at the time of the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, we take 1299 as its beginning, the beginning of the Ottoman dynasty. Anatolia at this time had fallen after the Seljuks had been in existence and then went out of existence. Anatolia was divided into multiple tens of small, essentially principalities, if you will, each run by its own prince or warlord. It's fractured. Now, it's one of these, this one here, founded by a man named Osman, that then grows into the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire has its beginnings here in the western part of Anatolia. And if you look at the map, you'll notice that where it begins to expand is not here, not in the Middle East, but rather it begins here, and very quickly it's expanding in the Balkans. And throughout its existence, it's really the Ottoman Empire, though we think of it as being Middle Eastern. And today, when we think of Middle Eastern, we think of the Arab world. And this part down here, it's really very much a Balkan empire. That is where the wealthiest land of the empire is, the most productive agriculturally, where most of the population is. And that's where it really begins its expansion, is here. It's only in 1453 when finally the Ottomans are able to take the last bit of the Byzantine Empire, the capital here, Istanbul, then Constantinople, today Istanbul. It's after that only that the Ottomans begin to turn from focusing on this area. They begin to push down into the Middle East, what we think today is the Middle East, and out to North Africa and expanding that way. But as you'll notice, they're still very much interested in pushing into the west and to the north. Now, when we think of the Ottoman Empire, oftentimes we think of it as a Turkish empire, which isn't really entirely correct. It is correct in the sense that the founding dynasty was Turkish, and that the court language they spoke, Ottoman Turkish, is a Turkic language. However, the ruling class, number one, did not see themselves as Turks. The word Turk was a word that applied really only to peasants. The Ottomans saw themselves as Ottomans, that is, the descendants of Osman, or as we pronounce it in English, Ottoman. The ruling class drew upon not simply Turks, but it drew upon all various peoples throughout the empire, Circassians from the Caucasus, various Slavic groups from the Balkans, Albanians, Arabs, you name it. Lots of different peoples. In fact, how many of you have heard of the Janissaries? Okay, the Janissaries were the elite fighting corps of the empire. They also supplied the empire's crack soldiers as well as the top bureaucrats. And the Janissaries, for example, were not Turks. They were, in fact, they had to be non-Muslims. They were Christian children adopted at a very young age, taken from their parents, and then raised by the Ottoman state. And they were taken from their families because that would ensure their loyalty to the Sultan, because the Sultan essentially in the state would become their new family. And this becomes the ruling elite of the empire. So it is a multi-ethnic state ruled by an elite that speaks a Turkic language, but one that's very heavily influenced, again, by Persian and by Arabic. And that language is not really that close to the Turkic languages that would be spoken by the peasantry. Now, as you might be wondering, as you look here, the Ottoman Empire, there is tremendous diversity, both geographically, so you have areas such as over here in North Africa, Egypt, You have mountainous areas over here in the Caucasus. You have, in the heart of Europe, the Danube, not very far. Here we are from Vienna. You go up here into today Ukraine, the Crimea. These are tremendous geographical variation and ethnic variation. And it's rather remarkable when you think of how is it one empire is able to rule such disparate, such variegated peoples and lands. And the key to really the Ottoman success was that they delegated a lot of authority to local rulers and accommodated local practices. That is, it was a relatively decentralized empire and one that was really quite flexible in its relations. So the Ottoman Empire, up until towards the end of the 17th century, that's where it begins to see about 1683 or so, is when it sees is the height of its territorial expansion. And it's in its next empire, the 18th century, when it begins to stagnate in terms of expansion, and then it begins to shrink. And the reason for that is essentially its European rivals, that is the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the British Empire. All these begin to pull ahead of the Ottomans in their technological ability, their organizational ability, their ability to project military power, their economies, and even demographically in terms of their populations. So beginning in, as I said, in the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire begins to undergo a decline or a constriction, a contraction. As the great powers begin to break off parts of it, first nibbling on the edges, and then coming in more and more into the center of the empire here, defined by Anatolia and the Arab lands here at the center. Now this contraction, as you can see up here, you can see the maps. It all looks relatively surgical, if you will. You see the borders drawn. Well, this part of the empire is lost at this date. That part of the empire is lost at another date. And a lot of this takes place in the diplomatic drawing rooms, where the European powers, after they defeat the Ottomans, then decide what parts of the empire they will take from it and what parts of the empire they will make nominally independent. But the thing I want to underscore tonight is that the contraction of the empire, which gathers more and more speed and accelerates in the 19th century, is one that is accompanied by a tremendous amount of human suffering and trauma. It's not a peaceful process by any means. And as the empire shrinks, you have, and as these parts of the empire are broken away, you have mass expulsions of the Muslim inhabitants of the empires, particularly from the Caucasus, from here, and from the Balkans, that gather strength throughout the 19th century. As the empire is contracting, and as the European powers are getting stronger, there is also a major change in international diplomacy that takes place. Beginning in the 18th century, and then again with growing in strength in the 19th century, what I call, or not simply I call, but what is called the national idea, essentially nationalism, begins to become an ever more influential doctrine. Basically, according to nationalism, or the national idea, the world is naturally divided into nations, and every nation deserves its own territory and its own state. Now that's an idea that seems to us rather commonsensical. It's embedded in our language. Even in universities where presumably we should know better, we should be a little more critical. For example, if you go to university, you can major in international relations. What we really mean by international relations, however, are not relations between groups of people. What we mean are relations between states. That is, we assume that there is a natural, and this really begins to pick up pace in the 19th century, we assume that there should be a coherence between what are nations, that is, groups of people that speak a common language, have a common past, have a common ethnicity, in states. and we assume that's how the world works, and that's how the world should work. But the key thing to keep in mind here, as I was stating, is that the Ottoman Empire is not in any way a nation state. It's an empire ruled by a dynasty that does not define itself in national terms, nor do its constituent peoples. The Ottoman Empire was was bound by, first and foremost, the idea of Islam, that led by the Sultan, who also claimed to be the Caliph, that is the ruler of all Muslims, ruler of all Sunni Muslims, and that was the main source of cohesion in the empire. Now, there are significant there were significant numbers of Christians, Jews as well, who lived in the empire, and they lived in what were essentially autonomous communities known as millets. There were the three major ones, and they were defined by religion, not by ethnicity. The three major ones were the Greek Orthodox millet, which applied not simply to Greeks, but to anyone practicing Orthodox Christianity. The Armenian millet, which is also applied not to the Armenian nation per se, but rather to the Armenian church. And then a Jewish millet. And that is, these were communities that were led by the religious leaders and were left more or less to determine their own internal affairs as they wished in agreement with their own religious and cultural traditions. Whereas the rest of the empire, the Muslims, are assumed to be Sunni. Not all of them are. That's a separate question, but the vast majority are Sunnis, and they are the ones that are loyal to the Sultan and to the Caliph. And that's how the empire is set up. Now, as the empire begins to break up, the national idea becomes more and more important. And it's usually the story is told in terms of, with the idea that the peoples within the empire become nationalists and then want to break away. So that when you get the Greek rebellion in the early 19th century, it's often told in the story of the Greeks want to break away, and then later the Serbs, the Bulgarians, etc. If you look more closely at really what happens is not so much that there is a growing sense of national identity among the peoples on the ground. Rather, there's a sense that this empire is beginning to break up. It's getting weak. You have the Europeans have already demonstrated their superiority over the Ottomans militarily. They're also demonstrating their superiority in terms of economics and in trade. And the idea begins to emerge, well, why stick with this empire? And particularly given that they know if you rise in rebellion, you can get outside aid from the great powers who will assist you to break from the empire. And so you have these new states that are set up that are established in the name or in a rough form of a nation state. One example of this, in 1877, 1878, Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire go to war. The Russians defeat the Ottomans, and as one of their conditions that they impose upon the Ottomans is they break away Bulgaria in 1878 and give it not quite officially full-fledged independence, but autonomy. And they do this, and they name this thing Bulgaria, even though the mass majority of the population, if you were to have asked them back then, they would not have defined themselves as Bulgarians. They would define themselves as Orthodox Christians. The vast majority are illiterate and don't even necessarily know, what does that mean? It doesn't have meaning to say you're a Bulgarian. So, and as these, as the states come into existence, they begin to they expel their Muslims through massacres and forced deportations. So the lesson taken from the contraction of the empire, the lesson taken by the ruling elite of the empire, it sees we're losing our empire because we've fallen behind the Europeans in terms of technology, in terms of organizational skill, in terms of military power, and in terms of economics, is that one, we have to reform and we have to do so rapidly, and that we had better start thinking about where our last stand is going to be. And so at the beginning, towards the end of the 19th century, they begin to look to this area here, Anatolia, as their final redoubt, their last fortress, their last bastion. Now, the reasons why they look to this, one, geography. As you can see here, the Europeans are pushing in through here. The British, with their fleet, grab Egypt. They're also operating in around the Arabian Peninsula, in the Gulf. The Russians are pushing down down into the Balkans and through the Caucasus. Likewise, you have the Austrians coming in this way as well. So it seems natural, for one, simply for geography, that you look to somewhere in here, it's the most remote part of your empire. Number two, they also notice that as their empire is broken up, it's broken up in the name of nationalism. That is, in the name of these ethnic groups, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, all these peoples are getting their own states. Then later the Albanians and others join in. And this area here is called by the Europeans, not by the Ottomans themselves. First, the Europeans start with this, call it Turkey. And they call it Turkey because the Europeans have always generally referred to Muslims in this period as, all Muslims are Turks, essentially, to them. Because that's how they knew Islam. As the Ottoman Empire is expanding into Europe, it's, of course, the Turks who are bringing it. So the point here being that the Europeans begin to think of terms of a Turkey well before the Ottomans themselves do. And it's only at the end of the 19th century when you get a handful of people begin to think of a handful of Ottomans who are beginning to think, geez, maybe we better think of this area here as our future, and we'll think of it as Turkey. Now, after the end of the Balkan Wars, is the wars that take place in 1912, 1913, when the new Balkan powers fall on the Ottoman Empire, inflict upon it disastrous defeats, and that's at this point is where you see the last part of the Ottoman Empire in Europe is this part right here. Now this, again, as mentioned at the beginning, is the heart of the empire. The empire's best territories are in here. And these wars in particular are accompanied by tremendous expulsions. You have about 600,000 people are expelled from the Balkans. And this is only the last wave, but it's the largest wave of people expelled from the Balkans. You had another 500,000 or so in the last half of the 19th century are pushed out of the Caucasus. And you had earlier in the 19th century, as I mentioned before, groups pushed out of the Balkans into Anatolia. So in 1912, 1913, things have grown quite desperate in the empire as it's shrinking. And you have World War I, breaks out in 1914. A year later, the Ottomans decide to throw themselves into the alliance with Germany, essentially for two reasons. One, they think that Germany has a good chance of winning this war. It was very logical. Germany almost did win the war. It made a lot of sense. Number two, they also do it because of all the great powers. Germany is the farthest from them. They already have the French have their eyes on this territory here. The French are already operating in North Africa. The British, likewise, already have Egypt at this point. And the British are active in the Gulf. And the Russians, likewise, have had their eyes on this territory here. And whereas Germany makes a great deal of sense, ally yourself with Germany. Germany is not yet. Germany has interest in this area and is thinking down the road we'd like to get involved and grab some territory, but not yet. So the Ottomans join in with the Germans in World War I as the last chance in their hopes of that if Germany wins the war, this will give them a breathing space to conduct reforms. Throughout the 19th century, they had been trying to carry out modernizing reforms, centralization, so they could put themselves on the same level as the Europeans. However, since they're constantly under attack from outside, it makes it a very difficult process for reform. Even under the best conditions, it would have been very difficult for them to reform. But again, as you see looking at the map here, you can see how they're constantly under stress from outside. And so they throw themselves into World War I as sort of their last shot at getting, or in the hopes that they'll finally be able to put through the reforms. If Germany wins, it'll win them some time. Now, as you know, Germany doesn't win. And you have with the defeat of Germany, that means essentially the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. And the great powers get together, and they come up with a treaty in the town of France, Sèvres, in 1920, and they set about with this to be the final partition of the Ottoman Empire. As you see here, you can see the empire has been partitioned over the course of the 19th century. And here, this is what's intended to be the final partitioning of the empire. See, this part here is decided to give this back to Greece. This part here is to go to Armenia. And this part here is to be an autonomous part, an autonomous Kurdistan, but with the idea that within an unspecified time, but eventually the idea is this will then become an independent Kurdish state. Now, as you see looking at this map, you'll notice there was a basic problem when I mentioned that those Ottomans in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, began thinking of calling this place here Turkey. Because as you look here, this seems to suggest, well, Anatolia, maybe there's a good number of Turks here, but it sure isn't ethnically homogeneous. It wasn't. You did have right here, along on the Aegean coast, a fair number of a significant population of Greeks. There are also Greeks at this point living on the northern coast here, the Black Sea. And then there are two other groups out here in eastern Anatolia. One is the Armenians, and the other is the Kurds. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, you have the emergence of what's called the Armenian question. I mentioned that war between Russia and the Ottomans in 1878, where the Russians, among other things, then create Bulgaria. Well, another thing that they do is they put on the international table, again, I'm using that word international, as one of the conditions for peace with the Ottoman Empire, they insist that the Ottoman Empire provide better security for its Armenian population that lives out here. Roughly 1/4 of the population out here is Armenian. In the treaty that they signed with the Ottomans, it requires the Ottoman state to carry out the reform of administration there to provide for the security of Armenians, to protect them from the depredations of Kurds and Circassians. Now, Circassians, probably most of you aren't familiar with that name. The Circassians are a group that comes from the Caucasus. They were one of the groups that were expelled by the Russians and who were then resettled out in this part of Anatolia. And you'll notice that if you look at the words of the treaty, there's no reference to Turks. The main problem is between the Armenians and the Kurds and Circassians. And the reason why there's much reference for Turks is because there aren't all that many out there. The dominant group are the Kurds, and we don't have the exact figures, but probable that about 50% of the population or so is Kurdish. Another 25% is Armenian, and then the rest is made up of other smaller groups, the Turks being one of them. Now, the Russians make this a part of their terms of peace with the Ottomans. But the other great powers, in fact, intervene here, and they insist, they take this away from Russia and say it's not simply Russia's prerogative to intervene in case the Ottomans do not come through with their reforms. They say all the great powers have the right, not the obligation, but the right to intervene on behalf of the Armenians if reforms are not conducted to provide for the protection of the Armenians. Now that might seem, well, relatively straightforward, something for a state to do, provide security, basic security for its inhabitants. Well, it's particularly difficult for the Ottomans because this part of the empire has never really been under central control. Again, the heart of the empire was always in this part here and in the Balkans, and they never gave it, the eastern Anatolian parts, all that much attention. And the main groups they have running around there are the Kurdish tribes. They are the real force there, and they only pay nominal allegiance to the Sultan in Istanbul. And so when the Europeans are calling upon the Ottomans, you've got to restrain the Kurds and protect the Armenians from them, that's not so easily done, because when the Ottomans do attempt to crack down, they face a problem with the tribes. And you might be able to, several years ago, it might have maybe, but it's probably easier for you to grasp that now if you think of the difficulties the United States has had in Iraq or in Afghanistan in dealing with tribes. So as the Ottomans try to build up their state institutions there. They try to crack down on the tribes, but then they're faced with multiple rebellions, uprisings, etc. And even as they're doing that, the Europeans, when it suits their purposes, will threaten to intervene on behalf of the Armenians. And right before World War I, in fact, Russia was making very explicit threats to intervene on behalf of the Armenians. Yet at the same time, what Russia was doing was backing the Kurdish tribes, and in fact encouraging them to carry out attacks on Armenians. So the point of this is that by the time of World War I, the Ottomans essentially have come to the ones who are ruling the Ottoman Empire have essentially come to the conclusion that as long as we have this group here, excuse me, the Armenians, living on our territory, and this is the last territory that really is basically our last stand. As long as they're there, we are never going to have peace because there is always going to be an excuse for the great powers to intervene. So what happens is that during the war, there are rebellions by Armenians behind Ottoman lines as the Russian army begins to move in here. The Ottomans start by deporting them. It starts with security measures. They begin to deport them down to this area here, into Syria, and down here into Iraq, and into this part of Anatolia down in here. They start mass deportations, the entire Armenian population, and essentially the idea is, well, if most of them die off, all the better, because then we won't have to deal with them. Now this becomes significant after the war, when they've lost the war, and you see here this Treaty of Sevres is decided by the great powers to divide up Anatolia, with this part here in yellow going to Greece. This here is to be under Italian influence. This here is going to be under French influence with a autonomous Kurdistan, eventually become an independent Kurdistan. And this now will become, this territory here, will become part of a new Armenian state. Now the Turks have been defeated, and the Sultan, in order to hold on to his throne, is willing, he agrees to this treaty. However, the Turkish military is not willing to agree to this, and they're led by a man named Mustafa Kemal, then later known as Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who rallies the remnants of the Ottoman army and the Muslims of Anatolia, that is the Turks, the Kurds, and all those various immigrant groups that I mentioned in here, to fight and to resist the imposition of this program. And it's the prospect, the specter of being ruled by the Greeks, who begin sending an army that comes into this as far as here into Anatolia, and being ruled by the Armenians. That is, these are the peoples who the Muslims used to rule over. Now the Muslims are facing the possibility that we're going to be ruled by them. This serves to really galvanize the population. And they're able to defeat, first they drive back the Armenians back into the Caucasus, and then they end up driving out the Greeks, the French and the Italians, and eventually the British, all throw out their hands as well. After World War I, they're exhausted and decide, well, it's really not worth it to us to impose our will on this territory. So they agree to withdraw. And you have the Treaty of Lausanne is signed in 1923, which essentially establishes the boundaries of modern Turkey. Now, after the Muslims of Anatolia under Mustafa Kemal defeat the Greeks, well, I should say rather first before that, they essentially annihilated the Armenian population during World War I. And that's one reason why they were able to defeat the Armenians and drive them back into the Caucasus relatively easily. After they drive out the Greeks, they then sign a population exchange with Greece. Again, this is a reflection of the national idea, wherein they agree to expel roughly 1 million Greeks. Well, they're not actually Greeks, they're Orthodox Christians. Many of them don't even really speak Greek, they speak Turkish, but they practice Christianity. They are expelled from Anatolia. Likewise, from Greece expels roughly 500,000 or so Muslims. They call them Turks, but again, oftentimes they don't speak Turkish. They speak Greek or even other languages, but they practice Islam, so they're considered, the idea here is we're expelling national populations, so they call them Greeks and Turks, and exchange them. So you've taken care of the Armenian population through annihilation. You take care of the Greek population through this forced mass expulsion. And now they set up what is they declare the Republic of Turkey, what we today know as Turkey. These borders are established at Lausanne. With a slight change here, you have this area is later the French, who are in control of Syria, give this to Turkey, and that sets the borders of the Turkish Republic. Now, under the influence of the national idea, they call this thing the Turkish Republic. And the project here is to transform all these Muslims, now the population is almost somewhere close to 99% Muslim, is to transform them into Turks. So the goal is to make the Turkish Republic a more legitimate republic by making it a true nation state, by making it 100% Turkish. Because once you have a republic or a state that is 100% ethnically homogenous, then you can't get outsiders coming around and agitating on behalf of the various groups inside, while encouraging them to revolt or to break away. So that's one goal that they have. That's one motivation they have for pursuing this project of Turkification. Related to it is that the republic is also a secular republic in orientation. And when you throw out Islam, which was sort of the raison d'etre of the Ottoman Empire, you need a new form of collective identity, a new principle around which people can unify, and that new principle is now to be Turkish nationalism. So they declare everyone who lives within the borders of the Turkish Republic, all the Muslims, are classified as Turks. By the Treaty of Lausanne, they had to recognize that there are minorities, that is Armenians, Jews, and Greeks. But there's such a small number, roughly 1% or so, that they're really not significant. Everyone else, all the Muslims, are declared Turks, regardless if they're really Albanian or Bosnian, Arab, or Laz, Kurdish, you name it. They're all officially regarded by the state as Turkish. Now, to encourage the Turkification of the population and the assimilation of the population to a Turkish identity, the state does a number of things. It permits only the Turkish language, so it's the only language of state, the only official language, the only language used in schools. It's the only language that's permitted for publications. They ban all ethnic associations. So you wouldn't have Turkish Arab associations, Turkish Circassian associations. Those are banned. They changed names of areas in Turkey. A great many places are given new names that are Turkish sounding. So you take a place like Dersim, which was a region in the eastern part of Anatolia, predominantly inherited by Kurds. It was long known for its rebellions. That is given the new name Tunceli, which is a Turkish name. All these things are done in order to encourage the population to become a homogeneous one. They also seek to cut themselves off from their neighbors. That is, they repudiate their imperial past. The Ottoman Empire, the Arab lands were an essential part of the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish Republic, however, wants nothing to do with them, because that would interfere with the development of a Turkish identity inside the Republic, and they feel that they've had enough entanglements in running an empire. Essentially, they want to be left alone. So they cut themselves off from their neighbors, and that's done by a number of things such as the Turkish language, which used to be written in the Arabic script. In 1928, they throw that out and adopt the Latin script, which was another way of breaking themselves off from Islam. An Arabic script is the script of the Quran. Now you switch to the Latin script. They begin to purify the language. Turkish had been very, under the Ottomans, had been very influenced. A tremendous amount of vocabulary came from Arabic and Persian. They begin to toss a lot of that out. And with their neighbors, even though they were formerly had all been in this empire together, the Ottomans instead, the Turks, and follow correct but rather cool relations with all their neighbors. So with Syria, with Iran, with Iraq, they do not have very close relations. They do not encourage interchange between the populations, and essentially they try to quarantine themselves from the Middle East, which the new elites of the empire see as a swamp. As a source of backwardness, they regard religion as a source of backwardness, and all the bad things that they had from the empire. Now, this project of Turkification is remarkably successful for just about every group except for one, and that is the Kurds. Now, why are the Kurds, why do they have such a problem Turkifying the Kurds? Whereas they're able to do it with the Albanians who live among them, with the Circassians, with the Pomaks, various Slavic groups that had been expelled and had come to Anatolia. And the reason why is, if you look here, probably this is the better map, for two reasons. One is that the Kurds are a large group. They are roughly 15 to 20% of the current population of Turkey, and this holds true even if you go back to the earlier parts of the Republic. The Turkish Republic was established in 1923, so even back then they're probably about 15%. Now they're maybe closer to 20%. So it's a large number of people, and if you look at this map, you'll see they're densely populated, compactly settled here. So trying to get them to forget, in essence, that they're Kurds and become Turks is much more difficult because you can't break them up as you can the other smaller groups. When broken up into small communities, will much more easily adapt to Turkish language and Turkish customs, Turkish culture. With the Kurds, however, it's vastly more difficult. Now, along with that, I mentioned that the Kurds have their own indigenous structures. They're tribal. And this area out here is relatively undeveloped. And the Turkish Republic doesn't have a whole lot of resources. So another problem that they have is they don't have much money to build schools, to introduce state institutions, and other forms of, I guess, state administration that would break down the tribes, the tribal structures, and encourage the assimilation of the population. So the Kurds, throughout the Republic, the Kurdish question has been a huge problem. It's probably the biggest problem facing Turkey. How did they deal with the problem? They have tried to assimilate the Kurds, but that has not been very successful. At various times, the Kurds, early in the Republic, attempted revolts, a number of revolts in the 1920s and the early 1930s. The response of the Turkish state was to suppress them very fiercely. That worked for a time. For the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, it's relatively quiet, but things begin to heat up in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s, you have the emergence of what's called the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known by its initials, the PKK, which begins a guerrilla war that lasts throughout the 1980s into the 1990s. It's a very difficult war for the Turks. Roughly 30,000 people, most of those Kurds, are killed in this area here. It gets so bad that at one point the PKK is even willing to attempt to try to go from fighting a guerrilla war to actually fighting the Turkish army almost with large units in set piece battles. However, by 1999, by the late 1990s, the Turkish military is able to turn things around, is able to, has the PKK on the run, and then in 1999 manages to capture its founder and its leader, a guy named here, Abdullah Öcalan. And you'll see the picture here as he stands in front of the Turkish flag, and that's a very deliberate statement to make the point that this is Turkey, and we have succeeded in defeating our number one separatist. And he's currently alive in the Turkish jail cell. Now, along with that, I should mention one of the things that they ways to impress upon the Kurdish population that this is Turkey is that literally you will see if you go out into eastern Anatolia, inside of Turkey, you will see in the landscape, on the sides of mountains, etc., you'll see the symbol of Turkey, the star and the crescent, and then various slogans. One of those popular the two most popular are this homeland is indivisible. That is, it's making an open statement that we will not let this country be divided. The Turkish Republic will not be divided. And then this one right here, Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene, which means, oh, what joy, happy is he who calls himself a Turk. So this is a very sort of in-your-face way of telling the population, you are Turkish, and this country will not be divided, whether you like it or not. Now, perhaps one of the best, despite the fact that the Turkish Republic has been so insistent upon the existence on the fact that only a Turkish identity can be accepted, that it will not tolerate any talk of Kurdish separatism. Perhaps the most effective way of demonstrating sort of the failure of the Turkification of the Kurds are in election results. Now, one of the ways that they sought to prevent any kind of Kurdish political identity from growing is that you cannot have a Kurdish political party. And they instituted in 1980 with their constitution, you can't have a party in order to enter the parliament has to get at least 10% of the popular vote. And that's to keep out sort of ethnic separatist parties and other sort of special interest parties. First and foremost, but not only, the Kurdish parties. So what you have is that you have a number of parties, the Kurds that have attempted to set up parties that aren't called Kurdish parties. And the current one is one known as the Democratic Society Party. So there's nothing about Kurdish in the title, but everybody knows it's really the Kurds party. And just take these election results from 2009, you'll see this is the Democratic Society Party. And you can see right here in these areas, this is the difference between these is, right, these are the parliamentary elections and these are the mayoral elections. You'll see in both of them, that party does tremendously well in these areas here, which tells you that there is still a very strong, not simply a Kurdish cultural identity, but even a rather strong political identity. Now, in 2002, you had a new political party. Many of you probably have heard of it if you've been following Turkey at all, known as the AKP. That's its Turkish acronym. What it means is the Justice and Development Party. They came to power in 2002. This is a party that has Islamist roots. It's not exactly, well, it's a debated question, how Islamist is it? But it certainly does, its members do come from an Islamist background. And that's significant here on the Kurdish issue for two reasons. One is that, as I mentioned, when the Turkish Republic was established, one of the characteristics of it was a rather militant secularism. And the political expressions of Islam were forbidden. all mosques, etc., were brought under the control of the state, and the state essentially sought to monopolize the practice of religion. And depicted, likewise, Islam in the schools and in popular materials with a great deal of skepticism. That it fluctuates throughout the history of the Republic, but generally speaking, the establishment, the state, has had a very ambivalent attitude towards Islam. So now, for the first time, really, in the Republic's history, where you have a party with clear Islamist roots coming to power, this is significant because they are a group of people who, like the Kurds, share a certain ambivalence about the founding of the Turkish Republic. That they have certain questions about the project established by Mustafa Kemal of insisting upon the secularization and the Turkification of society. So they are willing to question the dogmas that they've been raised with. And in this way, they have found an alliance with liberals in Turkey, who are a very small group, but are influential in some sectors of opinion making, who likewise have favored this sort of questioning of the Kemalist orthodoxies. Likewise, they've tended to look upon the Kurds as not being a foreign group, not as a group that seeks to tear apart their country, but rather as a group with which they share a common bond in Islam and a common past, a common history. And remember, that I was talking about when the great powers attempted to partition Turkey in this Treaty of Sevres, and there was this war, what was later comes to be called the Turkish War of Liberation, but it's really not the War of Turks so much as Anatolian Muslims. They remember that period, and so they have there's still this sense of brotherhood that they feel towards the Kurds. Now, whether or not, this government this year has undertaken a whole range of initiatives to accommodate the Kurds. One, there is a tremendous, they have not banned, this is rather amazing, although everyone knows that this party, the Democratic Society Party, is essentially the party of the Kurds. It has not been banned. And that in itself is a remarkable development. This year they have promised, or they have undertaken a whole range of initiatives to overcome the relations, or rather to accommodate the Kurds by putting in more, they have now actually have official broadcasts in Kurdish. So now the Kurdish language is not only permitted in public, but they are now actually, the state is broadcasting to the Kurds. They are now permitting people to study the Kurdish language openly. That had also been absolutely forbidden just a few years ago. You couldn't even talk about it. That's now permitted. And just recently, in fact, actually today, they just recently passed a new amnesty for those people who have been fighting as part of the PKK, fighting in this guerrilla war against the Turks. They've announced an amnesty, and just today about 34 people came across the border from Iraq into Turkey. So they are trying to overcome or come up with a new compact for a new Turkey that's trying to move away from this militant Turkification and secularization. Now, there are problems with this, however. One of them, that sounds nice. Well, let's just admit that we have Kurds living among us. Well, we'll openly acknowledge the existence of Kurdish identity. However, that raises, this is the problem with emphasizing the shared, to say, okay, we're both Muslims. Let's work with that. That's what we hold in common, because that would suddenly then throw into question the secular identity of the Turkish Republic, and that opens up a whole can of worms. If you simply say everyone should have their own ethnic identity, then the question becomes, what really holds us together? And you have, coming back here, you do have, you see the Kurds extend into Iraq, into Iran, and you essentially might be throwing open the whole question of borders here. So the question, how far do you go in acknowledging Kurdish identity? Where does it stop? There are a number of Kurds, and no one knows exactly how far does the Kurdish leadership want to push it, but you have many who are insistent that, yes, we should get our own state. How far will they push for that? It's anyone's guess. One factor that does make it more, gives me some cause for optimism, that perhaps the Kurds wouldn't insist upon going full bore to break away from Turkey, and that is the fact that you have had massive migration for economic and for reasons of the war that were fought in the 1990s of Kurds from the eastern part of Turkey out to the west. So the largest Kurdish city in the world is in fact Istanbul. It's the city with the largest Kurdish population. So there are plenty of Kurds today who recognize this, that breaking away from Turkey, even they might be Kurdish nationalists, getting your own state doesn't solve your problems. And in fact, it might create even more problems for Kurds because they would have a great deal of their population, in fact, some of their wealthier parts of the population that are currently living in the western part of Turkey. So if you were, for example, to establish new borders out here someplace, you'd be cutting yourself off from a large part of your own nation. I've already gone on quite a bit. I was going to say a few words about relations with Syria, with Armenia, but I've already run over. So I think I'll end right there. But pointing out this is the burdens of empire, the Kurds are one of them. You had this reaction by the founding elites of the Turkish Republic, which repudiated the empire, tried to bury the imperial past, and turn this country, excuse me, let me go back to the map of Turkey, tried to turn this region here into something that really was 100%, or at least 99% Muslim and Turkish. Put a lot of effort into it, caused a lot of grief and pain, has not succeeded. The current government today is no longer in denial of that and is trying to find a way to resolve it. So I think I'll end right there. Thank you. Absolutely. Yes. That's an excellent question. The question was, with the rise of the Justice and Development Party, which has Islamist roots, what is the current status of Turkey's application candidacy for membership in the European Union? That's an excellent question. One of the reasons why the AKP, that's the party in power, was able to get a lot of support from liberals is because they were very insistent, yes, we want to join the EU, we want to be more democratic. And one of the reasons for saying this is because they thought, they believed the EU, a more democratic society in Turkey, is one that would give more freedom for the practice of religion, so that Turks could practice Islam the way they want to, and not simply the way that they're taught to or they're allowed to practice in the state-run mosques, etc. Now, a lot of people, critics of the party, said, well, they aren't really honest. What they want is they want the weakening of the liberalization of Turkish society so that they'll get more power and they can then Islamize Turkish society by taking advantage of the new freedoms, and then they'll say, well, thank you, we don't need the EU anymore. And so they'll never take it to the EU. I'm not quite so cynical as to agree with that. I think there was among the party, because one of the party does have Islamist roots, but it also has a very strong core of businessmen who are, like businessmen everywhere, interested in making money. And I think they really were interested in joining the EU, and I think many of them still are. However, Europe has been very ambivalent, and I really blame the Europeans for this. They have not really decided, do we really want Europe where Turkey is a part of it, or do we not? And many of them they're hesitant at best, they're ambivalent about it. And there are good reasons for that. The population of Turkey, if Turkey were to join the EU, it would be it would be the second largest state inside of the EU, which would give it tremendous voice at the parliament, where the European Parliament it's apportioned according to population. So there are real problems in bringing in Turkey, leaving aside the whole question of being predominantly Muslim, etc. Borders with Syria, border with Iraq. But the thing that really makes me doubt the current orientation of the Turkish Republic was what just took place this past week, where the foreign minister of Turkey, who's a fascinating figure, went to Syria where they signed a whole raft of agreements. They have now eliminated visas between the two countries, are looking really to almost integrate the two economies, and have set up a strategic cooperation council. Now, in doing so, the Turkish foreign minister is of the view that you shouldn't have to choose between having good relationships with your neighbors and being a member of the EU, which I absolutely agree with. However, the nature of the relationship they're setting up now with Syria is such an enthusiastic one, and it's such a problematic one because of the nature of the Syrian regime, that I'm wondering now, I suspect that they really have decided, well, we're never going to get into the EU. The EU is not really serious, so the heck with them. So it's an excellent question. The jury's still out, but I'm more pessimistic about it today, both regarding the European views of Turkey, but also perhaps I think the Turkish views of the EU. Yes? That's an excellent question. The Turkish military, essentially when the Turkish Republic is established, it's established by military officers. They are the ones who take it upon themselves to rally the people and to fight. And because they were very conscious of how their country had fallen behind the Europeans, and they saw the need, if they're going to survive, that we have to enforce upon their society radical reform, meaning, again, there's radical secularization and the insistence upon the Turkish identity. So that starts at the very beginning of the Republic. And the Turkish army has always seen itself really as the guardian of the Republic, not simply from outside enemies, but from internal ones. And the two main internal enemies are, one, the Kurds, and that's, again, to go back to this is the Turkish, where was it? This is the Turkish military. It's the Turkish military. They're the ones who will put on the countryside these symbols. So the two main enemies they've seen, or threats to the Turkish Republic, are, one, the Kurds, because they pose an ethnic separatist threat, and then various Islamist groups who threaten the secular characteristic of the Republic. They have been, the Turkish military is still very, very skeptical and hostile to the Islamists, and they have been to the Justice and Development Party. However, with the reforms that were been passed within Turkey since the Justice and Development Party came to power in 2002, and these are part of the effort to get into the EU to liberalize, the military has lost a great deal of its authority, both its formal authority within society, its power over various decision-making bodies inside the government, its voice has been reduced, but also its authority more generally over society. Turkish society today, it's much better educated than it was in the past, and people are much more critical of the military. So, for example, last year, when the gentleman by the name of Abdullah Gül, who was one of the leaders, founders of this, the party of the Justice and Development Party, he became a candidate to become president of the Republic. The Turkish military threatened to do something. They made it very clear, we don't like this at all. We think this threatens the Republic. This guy is too pro-Islam to become president of the Republic. And the presidency in the presidency in Turkey is more of a symbolic post than it is an executive one. The prime minister has more authority, but it's still, it's a very important symbolic post. And by nominating Abdullah Gül, this gentleman from the Justice and Development Party, for the post, it was really a way of the Justice and Development Party saying, we're the ones in power now, and we will do what we want. The military made it clear that we don't like this, but it still went through. So that tells you right now that the military has not, it's not completely out of the picture in politics, but it is nowhere nearly as influential as it was. Let's say it was, I think, 1998, when you had another Islamist party that was in power as part of a coalition. The military brought down the coalition. in what was called a postmodern coup. They didn't actually seize power, but they let it be known, we don't like this current government, and that government fell. They tried to do something similar last year, and it failed. So the answer to the question is the military today is much less powerful. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, it's an extremely complex question. I didn't. Oh, excuse me. The question was, how did the expulsion of the Armenians turn into a genocide? And this was, with the burdens of empire. This is one of the largest ones, and the Turkey's attempting now to overcome this with an opening to Armenia. It was last week or the week before. They signed the protocol and agreement with Armenia, the state of Armenia, to establish formal diplomatic relations, to open the border between the two countries. And also part of the protocol there, they want to establish a historical commission to look into this question, how do we best label or what really happened in 1915, when, as I mentioned, you did have rebellions by Armenians during World War I as the Russian armies coming in. The Ottomans respond by expelling all the Armenians from that area, from Eastern Anatolia, and then other parts of the country as well. There are massacres that take place, and you have somewhere around close to 1 million Armenians die. Now, this isn't a coincidence. My own view of this, and it'll be addressed in a book that should be coming out next year. My own view on this is that they do start as deportations for security reasons. That is, there are revolts behind their enemy lines, and it's very clear. I've worked in the Russian archives, and the Russians are then supplying weapons to Armenians, and they do intend the Armenians to rise up and to assist them. There are Armenian units fighting on side of the Armenians, and this was not an unusual thing. Militaries in World War I were doing this all over the place, mass expulsion of populations. However, if you look at the places where they expel the Armenians, they expel them into deserts where they know that they're not going to survive. And if you look at what was taking place in the years leading up to World War I, as I mentioned, you have this problem between Armenians and Kurds. The great powers are insisting that the Ottomans, you have to protect the Armenians from the Kurds. Then you look what some great powers, and Russia in particular, is doing. It's also destabilizing things inside of Anatolia by assisting Kurdish separatists. So, you have, on the one hand, the Russians are insisting, you better put things in order. They're saying this, over the table, and then under the table, they're encouraging groups to stir up problems. The Ottomans come to the decision, as long as these groups as long as we have Armenians living on this territory, we're never going to have peace. So putting that together, it looks to me like what they did was during the expulsions decide, well, we need to do this for military reasons, but while we've got all these people on the way, if a lot of them die off, so much the better. That's going to make things a lot easier for us in the long run. And this, of course, is one of the things that enables them then after, again, look at the intention of the great powers was, right here, to divide up Anatolia and to give a good chunk of it to the Armenians, even though they're before the war, they're only about 25% of the population out here. They aren't able to do that. And one reason why, because there aren't that many Armenians left there. Does that answer your question?